Focus for today is really about kind of how do we support you on your systems mapping journey, especially with Kumu, but we'll talk about some of our other products. And what we'll try to do today is touch a little bit on kind of what some of our orientation to doing systems mapping, what kind of the worldviews that surround why we do it and how we try to hold that work. Then we'll spend a little bit of time just giving you some awareness around what are the different approaches and like exercises that people will use. For me, it's kind of going like, how do you go from a blank page to some semblance of a systems map? That is a relatively big topic. There's whole entire courses that are available. But just wanted to be able to give you a sense of like, hey, here's some different exercises, here's some different terminology that you might see. So that way you can think about what path you want to carry forward. And then we'll dive into actually using Kumu and making sure you understand the nuts and bolts of this is how to create a systems diagram within Kumu. Here's some of the things that you might run into and struggle with so that we can make that as smooth as possible. Again, if at any point there's a question, throw it into chat. I should be able to see it and would love to have this be as interactive as possible. We are going to dive in first and just talk a little bit about that worldview aspect. And so the first thing I'd flag is the way we try to approach the mapping and some of the problems that we're engaged in trying to support solving is really taking what I would call a complexity aware view. So an ant colony is a great example of a complex adaptive system. And the essence, right, when you think about a complex system is you actually can't understand the whole by understanding the parts, right? And so much of our analysis techniques end up involving things of like breaking down into these smaller pieces, trying to understand those parts. And then we think we're somehow going to have these insights in how we move the whole, which ends up not being true. And so much of Kumu is built around how do we focus more on the relationships among the parts, right? Really thinking about what is the whole, how do these all interact, even including things like profiles allow you to describe the relationship more. And so really shifting into this frame of having the focus be more on the relationships than the individual parts. It also brings in a humility too, where you're not actually going to be able to predict the behavior of a complex system. And when you have a map, it can be tricky to think. The frame is kind of this idea of like, the map is not the territory, right? The map is not this prescriptive, if you do this, and this will happen. Instead, we like to hold it much more of as a awareness building tool and a sense making tool, something that hopefully will then remove some blind spots for you, look at different parts, different factors, different aspect that you maybe didn't consider before, and allow you to have a broader awareness and be able to learn from and actually spend intentional time on a wider range of things than you might otherwise would have considered. The other one is the contrast between thinking of yourself as a gardener and then the contrast for me is a chess player. And so often people approach systems mapping more as a chess player, right? It's like, hey, I'm going to create my strategy with this. I've created this map. If I do A, then this leads to B, this leads to C, which is so entirely different than if you have the mindset of a gardener of really thinking about, hey, how do I tend to the soil? What are the different conditions that would need to be there? What are all the different relationships that exist in this garden that need to be in balance? And how do we cultivate the conditions for there to be health over time? And how are we optimizing for long-term health? And so really try to sit in this context of like, how are we being a gardener? Where are we falling prey to more of this strategic chess player mindset and kind of getting a little bit too cerebral or academic, and instead, how can we come back to this frame? And then the last is really trying to focus on the importance and the power of narrative and story. Again, we can get to a map and it can feel pretty technical, and we can lose the richness of the stories that people tell about their experience within a system. And that nuance and context is so important for doing a couple of things. One, for making sure we really have truly captured some of the core dynamics. A lot of times what will happen is when a map gets created, someone hopefully has gone out and had lots of these conversations. They've been in community with others. The actual community themselves are pulling together. They're understanding the complex system, creating this map. And then you get this artifact that loses the richness. And so the way Kumu has been designed is to try to carry that narrative across, right? There's lots of different opportunities to include stories alongside the description of a particular connection or a loop that you're creating, but would just encourage you to always be thinking about like, how do we come back to narrative? How do we be effective storytellers when we're sharing the map? But also, how do we make sure we're bringing people's experiences and stories from their experience of a complex system into the mapping process wherever possible? Again, you want to make sure you're sensitive to like things around anonymity and consent and all of that. But I think there's effective ways through all of that, but really try to not lose the importance of that narrative. So when people come to us and ask, hey, like I want to do systems mapping with Kumu, you'd think it was pretty straightforward, but people tend to do kind of one of two different paths for us on that. A lot of people come to us and say, hey, I want to build a systems mapping Kumu. And what they're wanting to do is actually on this left side, which we would characterize as an ecosystem or a stakeholder map. So their kind of desire is, and their thought is, hey, I will better understand this challenge I'm working on by better understanding the different players that are involved, maybe who they're connected to, what projects are they working on, what organizations are involved. And there's a lot of value in doing that, but it's distinct from the thing that's on the right, which is looking at what would traditionally be called a causal loop diagram. So actually looking at what are the different factors within a system, how are they related, looking at kind of webs of cause and effect. So as this thing increases or decreases, what other connections and what else does it affect within the system? And today's talk will be more focused on the type of mapping that's on this right side of the screen. Happy to circle back and touch about like kind of how to do stakeholder maps within Kumu, what the differences are. There's also some really neat opportunities for figuring out and talking through where you can actually integrate both of them. I think there's a lot of neat potential there, and that's kind of a frontier for us in Kumu of like, how do you do both? How do you make sure you have the stakeholder analysis that lives alongside the systems map that you're creating? So happy to touch on that, but yeah, most of the time we'll be focused more on this right-hand side. We are going to dive in now and show you some of kind of the two different platforms that we can use for doing this within Kumu. Kumu, technically a product, but also the name of our company. And the mission for us is building tools for tackling tough problems. And so Kumu is what we frame as our flagship product. We also have another platform called Sticky Studio, which is essentially our version of Mural or Miro. The goal has been, how do we create a really simple to use platform that prioritizes relationships and make relationships between stickies really easy to create, or relationships to other labels. So it's also participatory and real-time editing. And so it's our approach to solve the learning curve of Kumu, but it can be a great way to do some of the brainstorming work that's involved in the earlier steps of like, hey, how do we go from a blank page into having people generate? What are the different factors involved? What are some of the different connections? What are some of the loops? And so Sticky Studio is a great option for that. We'll walk through some templates that we have built out in it in just a moment. But then also wanted to show, for people who haven't seen it, Kumu. So this is what Kumu looks like. It is a pretty flexible relationship visualization platform. It's built on this idea of what we call elements. So those are the circles on the map, and then connections are the lines. And we can also have loops, which are the labels that you see here on the right-hand side. This is a map that the Hewlett Foundation built within Kumu. And what you'll see is there's a lot of room, right, for narrative. This left-hand sidebar is here to be able to describe the overall map. As you click on any one of the different elements or connections or loops, you also have a profile for each of those. And so you can add additional context. You can describe what you mean. Another really important pro tip for doing systems maps is when you create a connection between two factors, take the time to write on the connection, like, hey, here is why I think there's a causal connection here. Maybe you can reference, hey, I heard this come up in like these three specific stories, or this is what I just even mean or think about the connection being, but it'll save so much time in making it easier for other people to review that map later on. Our goal with Sticky Studio is trying to have it be simpler than Mural for sure. And we're still on a learning journey there to find out, like, have we struck the right balance between kind of simplicity, but having enough of a feature set. So you can help let us know whether or not we've achieved that. So let's do this. We will first dive into Sticky Studio, and we'll start talking through some of the different exercises you can do to start thinking about identifying factors and connections for your particular complex problem. This is Sticky Studio, and this is available as a template. I'll make sure we send the template link out as well, but also drop this link into chat in case anyone wants to hop in right now. And you can feel free to start kind of adding and building things out. If you want to have some sort of complex problem in your mind as you start to play around here, my recommendation would be maybe teen mental health. So if you're thinking about like following along or trying to add as we're walking through here, maybe think about that. It's like kind of despite our best efforts, why have we not been able to kind of create mental health for teens in the specific geographies that you live in? But I'll walk through and I'll explain some of what these different kind of exercises are. So first, this one is kind of this idea of an enablers and inhibitors sort. And so much of this is about thinking and supporting people to do brainstorms to just start to say, hey, what's involved in this system, right? Enablers and inhibitors is about what right now is enabling the like behavior that I want. So what's enabling teen mental health and what's inhibiting teen mental health, right? So, hey, one of the enablers for teen mental health might be a supportive family. So people can come in and start adding that here. An inhibitor might be the widespread adoption of social media. And so you can have people start to be thinking about, and the goal here, right, is just first get people starting to think about like, hey, what's helping, what's hurting? Can we start to have a conversation? Can we look at both like what's going well and what's not going well? So we don't get too lopsided, but people will usually do a quick sort on this. Then what you'll tend to move to sometimes is some sort of categorization. And so if you go to the right a little bit, there's these 3 buckets, and these are adapted from some buckets that Rob Risigliano has used. We call these beliefs, behaviors, and policies. But what this is really about is thinking, when we're doing this analysis, we're trying to think about individual factors. Can we think about different types of factors, right? So beliefs is really attitudes, norms, views, right? But that's an entirely different set than behaviors, which is really around like, hey, do I have the skills? Are the processes there? Am I like able to actually execute on a specific behavior that I want to be able to do? Versus things like policies, which are really around rules, structures, like regulation. What are the like larger things that may be harder to change, but when they do change, end up kind of unlocking a lot of potential? And so again, getting people to think across a range of these different areas is really important, because if you're focused on any one of them, right, you're probably not going to have an entire view of the system. And we tend to fall into one of these 3 buckets or have a favorite. And so doing the work to then try to say, hey, how do I have a process where we're working together as a group to start brainstorming what might factors be across each of these different areas? Usually the prompt up here, we've had this, despite our best efforts, why have we been unable to? That's a common structure, because part of it admits the kind of tricky, enduring nature of some of these challenges. Most of what people are using systems mapping to solve are challenges that have been tricky to solve. People are trying to move, but they're not able to make progress. And so this is really meant to say, hey, despite all of these efforts, despite people's well-intentioned efforts to try to make progress around teen mental health, why has it still been so hard to kind of move past that? And using that as a sort to try to identify these factors. So if you think about doing something like the enablers and the inhibitors, or this beliefs, behaviors, policies, what you probably have then is a bunch of individual sticky notes, or if you're on Kumu, you have a bunch of circles on the page, right? We're not getting in yet into like how those are connected, and we're definitely not getting into loops or an overall structure of a systems map yet. What I recommend is kind of taking it as a step-by-step process, right? So if these are maybe individual Lego pieces, the next thing we're doing is like connecting a couple Lego pieces together. And a common way to do that is with this upstream, downstream analysis. So basically what you're doing then is you're taking any one of these beliefs, behaviors, or policies, any one of these factors, you put it here in the center, and then you would then say, hey, what are the things that are upstream that actually affect this, right? So if I have in here emotional resilience, right? What are the upstream things that actually cause emotional resilience to increase or to decrease? And so you're doing this upstream work. And then if this is emotional resilience, you're also then saying, hey, if emotional resilience gets better, right, what are the downstream effects? And so I call these kind of like causal fragments. You're starting to create these like little pieces of connection that can then form parts of your map later on. And you do that with enough of these, and you'll start to see, oh, wow, like, yeah, this connects here. And you'll start to work towards some of the loops that you might notice on your map. You're not usually kind of like done there, right? It's not that you got lucky and you got causal fragments. They just tend to like loop back together. Normally, when you're trying to create the loops, you're having to really explicitly say like, hey, how do I close this, right? How do I say, if this is emotional resilience, what's next? So maybe that is then like, hey, if I have emotional resilience, I have like better coping strategies. If I have better coping strategies, maybe my mental health is better. If I have better mental health, maybe I'm going to have more supportive relationship. Maybe that's what gets us back, right? Maybe we're saying, hey, at that point, that actually gets us back. We can make the argument that supportive relationships have a direct effect on kind of emotional resilience. And so this is our loop, right? So maybe this is the thing that we create. But I just name it in that when you're trying to create loops, part of what you're trying to capture there is this enduring nature, right? Like if these things have been around, they're really hard to solve. there's these patterns that are going on again and again, some of which are great. They're kind of like trying to create healthy behavior over time, some of which are actually kind of spiraling out of control and creating negative behavior, some that are kind of balancing the systems out. But when you're trying to create loops, you really have to be intentional to say, hey, how do I get back to the start, right? How do I create a loop? How do I create a turn? And when I read that, is that something that feels like, wow, every time that we go through this, it's trying to like create a healthier and healthier system and healthier behavior. Hey, is this balancing out? And if so, is it balancing out in a way that like is actually preventing us from making progress? And then that starts to get you to things like, oh, wow, I wonder how we could interrupt that, right? If there's this piece where like I'm starting to make progress, but this peer dynamic comes back in and causes me to erase any gains that I've had, how do we interrupt that peer dynamic? That's really where you're starting to get into the analysis to say, hey, now we have a pretty robust picture of what the system is. What is that map telling me about some of the different areas I need to pay attention to? And then you go into this, okay, what might I do? What are some of the ideas on where you might intervene and how would you disrupt those patterns in a way that actually is enduring and can create a different sort of system health over time. The one other approach is, and it pulls a little bit more from kind of future sensing and scenario planning, but the idea of like, if you've heard the nomenclature of signals and trends too, that can also be a really productive way to get people thinking about what factors might be, and especially what are some of the peripheral factors. And so the difference between signals and trends is usually signals are kind of weaker, maybe one-off. You might notice in a particular context, it might just pop up occasionally. But there's these things that are like, huh, interesting. This might be something that is important to pay attention to with regard to the given problem that we're looking at. Whereas trends tend to be, hey, we're actually seeing a pattern emerge over time. We may actually think it has an effect on the system overall. We're maybe able to plot the behavior over time for a particular factor, right? Something around here might be the difference between kind of where we are right now around potential legislation, around limitations for like age and use and certain sorts of things on social media platforms versus like little signals around like, hey, the growing use of phones that are actually like don't have any access to social media, right? That are just the kind of like clean minimalist phones. And hey, is that a signal about something that might be coming later on that might create unlock in this problem over time? The other one too I'd frame is just drivers, right? Again, this all depends on the different language, what's most useful for your particular context. But a lot of people are pulled to like, hey, I think these things are the key drivers of the system, right? Like, and sometimes people have more energy around that, and you have to manage the like, hey, these are the three things that I think are the most important. And one of the techniques there is to capture that, right? Like, hey, great, what does everyone think those key drivers are? But have them walk back again, right? So if these are the four key drivers, hey, what do you think? What do you think is causing that? What's driving that driver? What's driving it? And kind of keep walking back, and you're starting to get to again more of these causal fragments that allow you to look upstream, find out, yeah, that might feel like it's really dominant, but it's hard to shift on that thing that you care about so much. We actually need to look upstream a little bit more to find out what's going on. But this will create space for people to bring a lot more factors into the room and also be talking about causality and kind of what they think is at play and why. The last one is this kind of what I call this more of the narrative path. And this involves collecting narratives and then just having people actually wrestle with, for a particular narrative, how do we extract what the individual factors might be and any connections we might hear. Some of them might just be four stickies, right? You might have a hear a narrative and just, hey, four disconnected stickies. I don't actually hear much in the way of kind of causality or cause and effect in the story. Others might feel really strong. People might have a very like visceral experience of like, hey, this is this like cycle I'm trapped in. It's really challenging. I can't break free. There may be addiction cycles and maybe a number of things like that people are able to actually articulate really, really well. And so you might actually have a loop that comes directly out of a narrative. But again, this can be a great way to connect any of the interviews that you might have as part of understanding a complex system and then pulling it and extracting it, but doing it in a way that you're carrying the through line. Someone else can come in here and say, oh, wow, Jeff, like you actually missed a big part of when I read through this, you missed a really big part of the meaning here, or the connections you draw. I think that's like a pretty big inference. Let's pause and think about whether or not that feels true. So it's a great way to engage in dialogue around that and have it be a much more human-centered process to building out these maps. That's a bunch of different exercises. Again, it's not that you'd want to do all of these, but hopefully that gives you a sense of, hey, if I'm getting started, you can do these on your own, but especially if you go kind of through one or a couple of these with a group, it can be a great way to get started in a systems mapping process. Chat right now, but yeah, if anyone has any questions they want to come off of mute for as well. One of the questions was, what's the best approach to using these? Do you use them in series? Are they more exclusive? The ones that I've seen used in series the most are more of this top row, right? So starting with things like enablers, inhibitors, starting to categorize some of them. Sometimes upstream and downstream, there'll be a blend of these two where you're basically doing enablers and inhibitors. You're picking out some of the factors that feel most relevant. We're like, hey, wow, this is a really compelling factor that we want to delve in more because it feels really important, salient. It feels like it might be an interesting source of insight, or it might feel like it's responsible for a key part of the behavior in the system. And then what they'll actually do is do upstream, where like for the upstream, they're making sure they find structural, attitudinal, and transactional, or in this case, beliefs, behaviors, policies for that upstream box, right? So they're forcing even that specific analysis to look across a range of different factors. And then that is all kind of input to the loop process. So there's usually some type of break where like a lot's collected and then people are starting to generate loops. These others I'd say are one, signals and trends is great to just be paying attention to. I think this is a good example of how do you keep a systems map alive, right? If you look at a systems map, if you're continually harvesting for signals and trends on top of that map and then coming back and revisiting it and considering updating it, I think that can be a great way. Key drivers for me, that would probably be an alternative to some of the enablers and inhibitors. And just some of that language, depending on the context, right? People from a business context have tended like the key drivers and the 5 whys and that sort of thing tend to be a little bit more in the comfort zone. And I think narratives can always play into it, but sometimes what you'll do a lot of time, if there is like a stakeholder interview process, those are captured in such a way and shared so that people have that as part of a pre-reading before you'd actually go into an enablers inhibitors process. So everyone's kind of benefiting those insights. But the explicit through line on that, I've seen people do less of, and I think it's just a great one to try to pay attention to. One other note too, so when you're doing this in Sticky, one of the things that we've tried to make easy is if you click on any one of these stickies, you can you'll see there's this comment icon. If you click here, you can actually add comments. And so this is a great way, again, when you're in Sticky, this part of the phase is pretty messy, right? You're wanting people to be generative, much more in like a brainstorm sort of mode, thinking out loud. And so having people add context about kind of why that's important, or if people have questions like, hey, I don't really understand what you mean by emotional resilience, getting people to go back and forth using that comment feature can be a really, really great way to engage a different sort of interaction for folks. And then all of this can get exported into Kumu. There might be a subset that you're exporting, right? Like you might not want every single piece of this in it, but you might be pulling out the different loops. But we do have a way to make it so you can easily pull the data that you put in here into Kumu. And that was one of the challenges and kind of why we created Sticky Studio to begin with, was because we thought lots of people going to Mural and Miro, especially kind of in early days of the pandemic, when people weren't able to do this sort of thing kind of together in a room with real Post-it. So how do we actually facilitate the ease of moving from something like Sticky into something like Kumu? One of the questions that comes up then is like, hey, when do I switch into Kumu? And you could do all of this in Kumu to begin with, but again, differences with Sticky are it's real time, so much easier to be participatory, whereas with Kumu, kind of when you refresh the page, it brings in any new changes. So you could technically be building out together in Kumu and just refreshing regularly, but I think it's a much richer experience to be doing that early participatory work here in Sticky. And then at some point when you're getting towards, hey, how do I pull this together into a cohesive whole? How do I add some more narrative and kind of storytelling around the map? That's oftentimes where you're moving into Kumu. And then you're focused more on, how do I create an engaging presentation? How do I think about color thoughtfully? How do I make sure that we can walk someone through this map without overwhelming them if they haven't been involved throughout the whole process? And so we can walk through some of kind of the key tips on how to do that within Kumu. So this is Kumu. When you create a project in Kumu, you'll get to pick a template. Let's just create a new map so you can see this. This is what you're presented for the sort of systems map that we're talking about today. Systems is the one I recommend picking. So you just click this and then it says elements will be fixed or floating. So fixed by default, which means wherever you move the circle on the map, it stays there. And then connections will be directed, mutual, or undirected by default. And so in our case, we actually want the line to have a direction and to show kind of as this changes, this other factor changes. So we want both fixed and directed. And you can just click get started, and then you're kind of ready to go. What you can do, so once you're in Kumu, the way to think about kind of your way around, so this left sidebar here is called the map overview. If you click, you can just edit this text here. And so a lot of times people will describe the overall system in it or describe a little bit of context of like, hey, what is the challenge that you're actually mapping? This right side is where you'll actually see the visual map. You can toggle this left sidebar open and close with these three dots. So that's something that you may want to do periodically. Up here, you have a drop down for switching between any maps. So when you create a project, you can have multiple maps within that project, and you can also have multiple views. And views are essentially how you do things like add colors, add sizing, add filters. And so you can pre-set up a couple different views. But today we'll be mostly working in kind of one map and one view. And then off to the right here, the settings button, this is where you control all the settings for that view. And again, adding, hey, I want to color by a particular field. I want to add a control, which is a way to give a little bit more simple interactivity to the map. So this settings button is something that you'll end up be using quite a lot. When you're actually adding content into Kumu, you can come down and click plus button. Again, you might have imported a file from Sticky, but if not, if you're actually just building it out by hand, you're coming down, you click plus, and you click add element, and you can add the name of the element. So say we'll do the supportive relationships example again. When I hit enter, that creates this on this map. I can move it around. Again, if I click this left sidebar, I can see the profile for this element. I could add a description about what this means. And I can also add any other fields, right? So I might have, say I have like a region field, and this is around, they were saying family and friends. Say that's that region. You can add data for each of the elements and each of the connections in a way that allows you to then color based on that later on. To add a connection, you can come down here and click add connection. This like most basic version would involve kind of typing an element in both sides. Or if I have already selected supportive relationship, I can click plus and add connection. And that's pre-populated there. So that's a little bit faster. And I could type a new element here, emotional resilience, hit enter, and then kind of place that wherever I want. And so that's one way. The other way we have is what's called sketch mode. So if I click sketch mode, you'll see in the bottom right corner, it says you're in sketch mode. There's instructions here if I want to then better understand exactly kind of how to do that. But essentially what this does is it makes it so I can just drag off an existing element and then let go on blank space. And then I can add the content to my map. So it's a much faster way to be building out a map. So anytime you're kind of creating a lot of factors or loops at once, I'd really recommend doing this because it'll speed it up a ton. And then when you're done, you can just click exit and it'll take you back out of that. But like this allows me to really quickly create that. You'll see I can't drag or move this element around. That's one of the challenges. And so you just click exit. And if I want to reposition these, I can set it up. And so that's the basic. So when you think about building out a loop in Kumu, you're first building out the individual elements and connections. You're kind of creating the structure of the loop. And then we have a process where you can actually add the label. So if you click add loop, it has you come through and click which of the connections are kind of made up in this loop. And then let's give it a label. So say, feeling well worded. And that's how you actually then have a loop as well. And if I click on the loop, I have a profile here. I might add a narrative, which just like gives the story behind what does this loop feel like when it's working well? What does it also feel like when it's not working well? Like so that there's two different versions of this loop. One where there's really supportive relationships, which leads to emotional resilience, which gives me effective coping strategy, which reinforces my mental health, which gives me more opportunities. I'm more willing to engage in relationships. And so this is like very positive loop. And there's a world where those relationships disappear and it can create a vicious cycle in the opposite way. The last thing, oftentimes in systems mapping, people will include a direction on the connection. Sometimes people will say like this is a same connection or an opposite connection. And so what that means is if as I have more supportive relationships, so as supportive relationships increase, what happens to my emotional resilience? So as we have more supportive relationships, we have more emotional resilience. So this would be what we'd call a same connection. Sometimes people will add that just right here as a label on the connection. And so the way I did that, I click on the connection, I can click up here and type a label and that will show up. Other times people will want a kind of a plus or a minus, either on one side of the connection or on both. And then those can be added here. So you'll see if I click back in, I click add connection type, and then I can choose, if I choose plus, that's basically another way of indicating same. And that's just showing a plus just on that far side. Sometimes people will also want to tell the very specific story, which they're telling the story of kind of both sides. So they're saying, hey, as supportive relationships increase, emotional resilience increases. So depending on kind of what approach to systems mapping you're following, people have different recommendations. So each of them are possible, and it really depends on kind of how you're using the map and what's most useful to you. You can also just say leads to more, right? There's ways of actually using pretty plain language that I think can make systems map even more easy to understand. And so go with your kind of intuition there on what actually is going to help people get to the level of understanding that allows them to be more effective in trying to influence more healthy behavior for the particular system that you're looking at. Let me show you a basic bit of some of the like decorating and styling. Before we do that, let me add just one other loop here so you can see it, and then we'll decorate them. So we'll go back into sketch mode. When you're in sketch mode, if you click anywhere too, that can add a new factor to the map. So we'll add social media usage. We'll connect that to exposure to DOI images. And in terms of the connections here, basically the narrative is that as social media usage increases, there's more exposure to idealized images. As more of that exposure happens, there's a negative impact on self-esteem through like unrealistic expectations. As self-esteem decreases, there's increased anxiety. And then because of that increased anxiety, there's actually more social media usage, either through like searching for validation or as a distraction. So it ends up being this loop that kind of spirals out of control in a negative way. So say maybe for these ones, this region is digital. So basically once I have that data saved for the factors for some of my maps, what I can then do is come over to here and click settings and then start to use some of these color by features. So if I do color by region, it'll automatically add those colors for me. And you can pick which color palette it uses. So whatever it finds, it'll add those and you're kind of just automatically up and running. So that's one option. Instead, what we could do is come down and add specific rules. So if it was really important kind of what color you use, you come down and click decorate element and then basically specify, hey, if the region is family and friends, I want the color to be purple. And then I'm going to include family and friends in the legend and click done. Then that'll add that there. And then similarly, I could click for digital. Region is digital. And then I can change the color. Maybe this is going to be green. Add a legend and click done. And so that's one way to set them up kind of one by one. So your choice, part of it's about kind of how well you want to, or how much you want in terms of control about the specific colors that are assigned for each. But that's the basics. So a lot of times what people are like doing when they're building Kumu is really focused on building out that structure, identifying what those factors are, building out the connections, identifying the loop labels, starting to add content, right? Add narrative, add descriptions for what's going on here, and then coming back and adding color on top. Because if you have 30 factors, they're all gray, it's a little bit harder to know where to start. And so people will often color by region, or they might flag like, hey, here's a certain factor that's maybe potentially more important or less important. And so they're just trying to draw your eye into an entry point of some kind. And then oftentimes what you can also do is do a bit of an unfolding by walking through a particular loop at a time. So we do have a feature called presentations that allows you to be able to do that and actually have that scripted within Kumu. You can click create your first presentation, add a title, and then you can start to add slides. And then you can have a particular loop be the focus of the slide. So if I click on the loop label, you'll see there's a focus icon which comes up here. If I click focus, this is now going to have just that loop be visible. And so that I can have that as my first slide. And then I could exit out of this and then I have not added the loop label for this one yet, but we could hold shift, select these different pieces, and then focus, selected. There you go. Select these, click focus. Now I have just those in view. and then have that be my second slide, save these changes, and I'll just walk through and show you what this looks like, publish. So this basically makes a link that you can send to someone, and it'll actually allow you to walk through and unfold the map piece by piece rather than overwhelming them. So now this would go to the next one. Again, instead of doing the multiple selection, we would have just added a loop label here. But you can see how you might unfold. Maybe you go loop by loop by loop, or you do a loop and then add another loop on. And so it's kind of growing in complexity over time. There's a lot of flexibility there, and presentations just kind of makes that really easy to do. The last thing is in terms of how to make a map more engaging, the other thing people will often do is add controls. And so these are just simple, easy things to click on that allow people some interactivity on a map without having to know everything about Kumu. So in this case, we said, hey, showcase elements by field. We're wanting to just allow people to highlight regions of a map. And so if we add that, say up at the top, and we want to do it by region, and I click save, what has now been added is now you see these buttons here. And if I click digital, it's going to highlight just the digital part of the map. If I click family and friends, it just highlights the family and friends part. And so it creates some neat interactivity that allows people to explore. It can be any sort of field or data that you have about the profile of a particular element or connection. So a lot of flexibility there. But oftentimes it's usually something like region, or if you've gone one step further and you're starting to look and analyze a map and look at leverage points, some of the things people will do there are things like, hey, where is a particular factor or dynamic field particularly stuck? Where does it feel there's energy in the system? Where, if this thing is unlocked, are there significant ripple effects? And so there's a lot of ways to then build that here into the sidebar as field data that you can then unlock and make more easily usable for people who aren't as familiar with Kumu using these controls up top. Yeah, Kinsey, you want to come off mute?
I've been looking for a way to capture some dynamism because I look at systems, but also systems change, and kind of something that would be more than just side by side, and thought about layers and like a dynamic visualization. So I just wondered if, I think you might have said something about change right as I was raising hand. I was curious about how you've worked with that or incorporated that into the platform.
Like, so one place that comes up is people will create a map and they'll have like the capture of like, hey, here's our understanding of how the system is working right now. And then maybe they'll come in here and they'll add another element. And this is like an intervention point. So say this is out here and they're coloring this maybe a little bit differently. So say they color this orange, and then they're kind of trying to say, hey, this is actually connected. This is going to influence this piece. And what they'll do is they'll actually try to showcase some of like the ripple effects. So they'll say, hey, as this thing changes, they're going to have this be then orange also, and maybe it's a little bit thicker. And then they'll show like, hey, it gets a little bit weaker here. Again, there's ways to do this more automatically, but this is the sort of visual people end up doing. And then maybe it gets to like a dotted line here. So that's more of like somehow people like add a like, hey, here's how I'm trying to showcase a bit of the like what I think the ripple effects are of a particular change on a system. So it's not that there's the live like dynamic calculations as much, but people are using visualizations to then capture like, hey, this influence is happening, and this is where I think it's going to end up having ripple effects on the system. Does that help?
It does. It does. The challenge I find is that I work with temporality, and so if I think of foresight, I think not just present state forward, but legacies. And so that's something that gets really cumbersome when you're using just lines. And so I'm interested in like how dimensionality can be factored in. And
well, and so like the other one for us is just like to the extent to which a lot of it depends on like where is the dimensionality coming into like, hey, new connections are there that weren't there before. You can certainly have like start date, end date type of stuff for any of the lines or any of the factors that then you use filters to say like, okay, we're going to create a view which is the like 2010 versus the 2020 view of this. And so we filter out some elements and connections in the 2010 view and add them in. Like, so that sort of thing is also possible, depending on kind of how you capture that data. I think the tricky part is oftentimes it ends up just being, when we've seen people do that, they're tending to create two distinct maps at two different points in time and comparing the two rather than using just like a filtering. So it almost is just like they're creating the static image at a point in time. They're just doing that twice based on or whatever number of points in time are most relevant for the analysis that they're doing.
Is there a layering option?
Layering in that there's like, you can filter, and so you can be creative, right? And like putting things like again, you could have the map and then have turn on intervention points and show that like on top of it. It's not the reason why I'm kind of pausing there is it's not a true like it's just using filters essentially. So you can show and hide elements and connections and do that creatively in a way that feels like layers, but it's not a true like layering or annotation that exists in some other functionality. It's all just done through the elements, connections, and loops, and then the filters that you have access to. And so someone else had asked, when you share a presentation or website, is it dynamic or does it reflect the map as it exists when you share it? It depends on whether it's a presentation or an embed. So we could also, if we just wanted to share this map, I could click share and then I can create an embed. This will be relatively real time. It's cached basically like for about an hour. But that one, anytime when someone goes to that, they'll see the latest version of the given map. Presentations are a little bit different in that you have a publishing step. So once you publish it, it stays fixed. And until you republish, those changes don't get updated, but you can republish whenever you want to. And so they behave a little bit differently, but both of those are options. So yeah, that's the essence of how to kind of start to build the structure there within Kumu. Again, one of the other things that people will do is they build out a map. They'll oftentimes identify one particular loop that they'll call a core story, right? So it's like, hey, what is some sort of feedback loop that allows the other loops to kind of hang together in a cohesive story? And then that will often be the loop that gets styled slightly differently, right? So maybe the connections in that loop are a little bit thicker so that people's eyes brought there, people start with kind of the core story and they build out from there. And so it's all stuff that is basically done using the same sorts of things we've already shown you here by doing the size by, the color by, or you can also do decorate connections and then change the size. And so relatively straightforward on how to do that. But yeah, that should be a good essence of kind of how to use Kumu for these different pieces. The last thing I wanted to talk through is a little bit about kind of how we make change in these spaces too, and what we actually have direct impact over. This is a new blog post that was done, collaboration by Rob and Anna Muyo around kind of thinking about financing within systems change. But what I wanted to flag is kind of just this dance of like how we hold the systems outcomes level, which I would describe as systems health. So we're thinking about something like team mental health, like, hey, what would that look like? What are the things that we would be paying attention to that capture what a healthy system looks like? And then that's not something that you can directly impact, right? And so you're having to come back to think about like, hey, what are the different conditions that need to be in place? That might be really specific to team mental health. Others might just be conditions that are part of kind of creating change, and how do we have a robust network, and how do we have people who are being able to learn and adapt over time. And so thinking about this split of capturing many of like much of what you capture within a systems map ends up being these dynamic enabling conditions. So what are those different pieces? How are they working together? What are helping right now? What are hurting? Where are we close? Where are we really far away? And then we have the project level, and that's where we're actually like people are engaging, they're doing work. And so remembering that like, hey, when you're doing projects, the projects actually then end up influencing the conditions, and the conditions play out together to actually create systems health. And so there's this sequencing that I think becomes really important, especially as like when you're holding a map and you start to then layer on like, here's an intervention point, or here's a project that we're working on, having this way to disaggregate and think about like, hey, we need to actually be really clear about what are the conditions that we're trying to create that allow us over time to generate a healthy system and have that kind of sustain its health over time. I found this to be a really helpful sort and a clarifying kind of paradigm for people to hold as they think about, okay, I now have a systems map. What's the next step, and how we start thinking about organizing action towards those changes that we want to make. And a lot of times the shift we're trying to get people to is when you think about projects, right? You're creating those more as kind of constellations where people are able to learn together. They're all wrestling with maybe the same or similar conditions. And so how do you create structures that allow that learning to happen? So we find out, hey, what is it really going to take to shift these conditions, which then over time can shift some of these outcomes. And we're happy to share. If you go to our blog.kumu.io, which is our Into Deep blog, you can kind of read this whole post and get a little bit more background on some of Rob's approach. Question was, can this kind of view be populated from stickies? We haven't created a template yet for this, but it's a great one where it's certainly possible for us to layer something in where we have this as a sticky template. And so we can circle back up and kind of send out that template to everyone who registered if there's interest in that. Wonderful. Well, that is all that we had planned for sharing today. So appreciate everyone making the time to hop on and kind of walk through this with us. And we're here to be supportive however we can. Happy to connect you to folks who can help. Again, especially if you're looking at like, hey, I actually need this type of support that is bringing someone in as a consultant to be leading a workshop. We're happy to connect you with the type of people who have used these sorts of things with large groups. And yeah, excited for you to be able to use Kumu and help you make more sense of some of the challenges you're trying to tackle.